I'm going to speak tonight on a pretty narrow topic, a little bit technical. I hope my good friend Comrade Moran won't scold me afterwards for it being too technical. I'll try to keep it at a general, accessible level. But I do think I want to address what seems to me an important point, which has been missed in all of the discussion about what's happening in Gaza. I've spoken on many occasions already on the history, on the context, on the concoctions, the fabrications, the contrivances by Israel's propagandists, a large number of which are in the United States. But one question which hasn't been addressed, I think, adequately, even by Israel's most severe critics within respectable public opinion, comes down to this. Do the guards of the Gaza ghetto, do they have a right to self-defense? Do the guards, the Israeli snipers, along the perimeter of Gaza, do they have a right to self-defense? Now, my former student and young friend, who goes by the name of Eric Abramov, can you raise your hand, who is a staunch defender of Israel, alongside the fact that he is an eligible bachelor, he will certainly answer emphatically yes. So, my challenge tonight is, can I, using the faculty and tools of reason, can I persuade him rationally, not hysterically, not emotionally, but rationally, that no, the guards along the perimeter of the Gaza ghetto, they have no right to self-defense. Okay, so let me begin. The international community has strongly condemned Israel's armed response to the overwhelmingly nonviolent demonstrations in Gaza. Now, as a factual matter, and as has been copiously documented by two young researchers named Jamie Stern Miner and Mohammed Shahada, there is no evidence whatsoever, none, that since the beginning of the demonstrations on March 30th, have the demonstrators used firearms or other weapons on the Gaza border. There is no evidence whatsoever that they have used weapons along the border. Leaving that aside for a moment, let's turn to that international condemnation. A UN General Assembly resolution, quote, deplored the use of any excessive, disproportionate, indiscriminate force by the Israeli forces against Palestinian civilians. Let me repeat it because it will be important for what I say later. They condemned, they deplored the use of any excessive, disproportionate, and indiscriminate force by the Israeli forces against Palestinian civilians. Some of you will recall on June 1st, Israel assassinated a 20-year-old young medic named Razan al-Najjar, a young woman of incomparable courage and heroism. She was approaching a wounded Palestinian. Her arms were raised. She was wearing the medic's outfit. There could be no mistaking or misconstruing her as a terrorist, let alone an armed terrorist. And she was shot dead in the back. After she was killed, the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, he said, he's an unusually wretched, cowardly, and craven creep. He goes by the name of Nikolai Mladenov. He warned Israel that, quote, it needs to calibrate its use of force. Not that it shouldn't be murdering medics who are unarmed and pose no threat, let alone a lethal threat, to the assassins poised on Gaza's border. He says Israel needs to calibrate its use of force. Human Rights Watch put out, in my opinion, an excellent report on Israel's use of armed lethal fire. It said Israeli forces' repeated use of lethal force in the Gaza Strip against demonstrators who posed no imminent threat to life may amount to war crimes. Now, I would again want to emphasize, for what I'm going to say later, the standard that Human Rights Watch, HRW, uses is, I left my phaser home, but anyone who has a cell phone, I don't set my phaser on stun. I set it on kill. So that's a word of warning. And if you still persist in that delinquency, I have handy a photon torpedo. So I would suggest everybody put their cell phones not on vibrate, put them on implode, because I loathe those devices. They are a curse and bane on civilization. So the standard that Human Rights Watch uses, you cannot use lethal force unless the demonstrators pose an imminent threat to life. Now, far be it from me not to welcome these condemnations. Of course, it's good to hear. The question nonetheless is, Do they go far enough? Simply put, does Israel have the right to use any force under any circumstances against the people of Gaza? If you look at the current legal debate, the current legal debate comes down to two questions. Number one, did Israeli snipers, as they're called, resort to excessive or disproportionate force against demonstrators? That's what the critics say. Israel used excessive or disproportionate force. Or, as Israel claims, was the amount of force used necessary to prevent protesters from breaching the perimeter fence? So was the force excessive and disproportionate, or was it necessary to prevent demonstrators from breaching the fence? And Comrade Abramov, even without my glasses, I could see he's nodding his head because he's thinking, that's right. They used the amount of force necessary to prevent the protesters from breaching the fence, invading Israel, creating murder and mayhem. The second question, a little technical, which I know is going to elicit a hostile reaction from Comrade Morin, and I debated whether or not to even bring it up, but there are some people here who want to be educated in the technicalities of law. So, there are two bodies of law which are applicable in situations like the one in Gaza. One is called international human rights law. And that basically means, is the situation in Gaza more like a domestic riot, or is it more like an armed conflict? If it's more like a domestic riot, then human rights law applies. If it's more like an armed conflict, then what's called international humanitarian law, or the laws of war, apply. Now, you might ask, what's the difference? In reality, actually, it's no different, because lawyers just sit around BSing. It has no impact whatever on what armies actually do. But for technical reasons, I'll just explain. When it comes to international human rights law, that is treating Gaza as if it's a domestic riot or protest that got out of hand, if you use that standard, then you're not allowed to use lethal weapons, deadly weapons, unless the demonstrators pose an imminent threat to your life. If they don't pose an imminent threat to your life, you can't use lethal force. But if it's closer to an armed conflict, a war, then, as you know, you're allowed to kill soldiers even if they don't present a threat to you. As long as they're combatants, they're wearing a uniform, you have the right to, like, pick them off, because it's the laws of war. So, having established the framework of the law, all parties to both these controversies, namely whether it's excessive and disproportionate or necessary, whether it's the laws of war or it's a domestic riot, everyone agrees on one common premise. And that premise is Israel does have a right to use force in order to prevent Gazans from breaching the fence. The dispute comes down to this: how much force? Critics who allege disproportionate or excessive force, they're tacitly acknowledging that Israel does have the right to use proportionate and moderate force. If you're condemning Israel for using disproportionate force, excessive force, then implicitly you're saying, but they do have the right to use proportionate force, moderate force. And those who say human rights law is applicable to the situation in Gaza, they say that if the demonstrators pose an imminent threat to a sniper's life, the sniper, the assassin, has the right to use force. Now I know that Comrade Abramov is thinking, and what's wrong with that? If the demonstrator is posing an imminent threat to the assassins poised on the border, the perimeter of Gaza, why shouldn't they have the right to use force? To which I reply, Tovarish Abramov, Tovarish being the Russian for comrade, to which I reply, but the fact is, Israel cannot claim a right to use any force in Gaza, whether it be moderate or excessive, proportionate or disproportionate, whether the protesters are unarmed or armed, whether they don't or do pose an imminent threat to life. Well, on its face, that's maybe not to this group of people who's filled with, this room being filled with Bolsheviks and the occasional Menshevik, but to the general public, it appears otherwise. They do have the right to use force in some situations, one might think, certainly Tovarish Abramov thinks so, but if you believe that, it's because the current debate, it ignores what international law actually has to say in the subject, and it abstracts from the specific situation in Gaza. Okay, so let me go through that. I want to go through first the law. What does the law say? And then I want to go to the specific situation in Gaza. Now, Tovarish Abramov, he wants to see the fireworks at Coney Island. Well, I'm going to see whether I can so captivate him with my reasoning that he decides, oh no, you have to meet a friend there, correct?
I could be a little late.
Okay, that's right. I appreciate that, Tovarish. So, let's first go through the law, and then let's look at the specific situation in Gaza. Under international law, the Palestinian people in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, are struggling to achieve their internationally validated right to self-determination. I am simply here, I'm not taking a position on whether Palestine is one entity or whether there is a state of Israel and a state of Palestine. I am simply telling you what the law says. Under the current state of international law, the West Bank and Gaza, the West Bank including East Jerusalem and Gaza, they constitute occupied Palestinian territory, and have been designated as the unit for Palestinian self-determination. So, the people of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, they have a right to self-determination. Under international law, and now I'm quoting the world's leading authority in the topic, James Crawford of Oxford, he says, international law prohibits, it bars the use of military force by an administering power to suppress widespread popular insurrections in a self-determination unit. That means, very simply, if a people is struggling for self-determination under international law, the administering power, in this case Israel, has no right to use force to suppress that struggle for self-determination. There is no right under international law for Israel to use any force to deny a people the right to self-determination. On the other hand, the people struggling for the right to self-determination, in our case, the Palestinians, there is no law, no legal standard that prevents them from using force to achieve their self-determination. That's the law. It happens that at this particular historical moment, the people of Gaza have elected, they have chosen to non-violently try to achieve their basic rights of self-determination. In this case, the most basic right, that is, in the face of an annihilatory siege, the right to breathe and live, they have chosen to use nonviolent methods. But even if they chose violent methods, they would still have the right under international law to use those methods against Israeli snipers who are obstructing their right to self-determination. Israel's use of force would be illegal even if they did use weapons. But in this case, they're not using weapons. It's a very strange fact. It's a very odd fact that when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, the allocation of rights and obligations is exactly the reverse of what the law says. So we're told repeatedly, Israel has the right to use force in self-defense against the Palestinians, and then we're told the Palestinians, in the course of their self-determination struggle, they need to wage it non-violently. Or as we were told for many a decade, where is the Palestinian Gandhi? Well, Palestinians were not obliged to search out a Gandhi. They have the right to use armed force. The right belongs to them, not to Israel. Israel has no right under international law to suppress the self-determination struggle using force. Now, here we come to a slightly technical problem. I hope Comrade Maren will forgive me. Maren, I don't know comrade in Arabic. I know you want me to say it in Arabic. I don't know it in Arabic. What's comrade in Arabic?
Comrade like Jundi.
What?
Jundi.
Jundi?
Jundi.
Jundi.
Soldier.
No, comrade.
I don't know.
Not soldier.
Got to be careful of who's doing the translating.
Yeah, right.
Right.
We end up with soldiers.
I thought he said Judy. Excuse me?
It's a Menshevik. Menshevik.
Maren just said she's not a comrade. She's still afraid of communism. She can't get over it. She can't get over the fear. I thought it was absolutely hilarious today, though. This is a totally irrelevant point, but it was so funny I have to mention it. There's the leader of the protests in the UK against Trump's visit. And she was on a TV show with Piers Morgan. Some of you may know him as one of the judges in Britain's Got Talent. And he's interviewing her, and he's very aggressively interviewing her, and he's saying, what about your hero, Barack Obama? He deported 2 million illegal immigrants. What about your hero, Barack Obama? She said, he's not my hero. She happens to be Indian, dark-skinned, so he just assumes she must support Barack Obama. And then he says, what about your hero, Barack Obama? And she says, you idiot, I'm a communist. What a breath of fresh air. How many people saw that? That was pretty funny.
Yeah. I saw it on Marty Goodman.
Yeah, it was pretty funny. You idiot, I'm a communist. Could you imagine on television? What? Rafiq?
Yeah.
Rafiq?
Yeah, I'm not Rafiq.
Okay. So, as I was saying, a little technical point. Under international law, Israel occupies Gaza. It's an occupying power. And under what's called the Fourth Geneva Convention, an occupying power has the right to maintain order and even to use force to maintain order. So, somebody might want to argue that because Israel is an occupying power, it has the right to use force in order to maintain order in Gaza. Is that true, though? So, let's look at what the law says. Number one, Israel has subjected Gaza to a protracted siege. The siege is a form of collective punishment. It has turned Gaza into what the UN has called an unlivable place. The siege of Gaza, in its current phase, it began in 2006, and just 3 days ago, it reached a new stage of an abomination. Israel decided that in order to stop those alleged threats posed by the kites, that it will not allow anything to enter Gaza except food and some medicines. Since 2015, it had been admitting some construction materials, But as of 3 days ago, Gaza is sealed shut except for food and some medicines. And nothing can be exported from Gaza. Nothing. Nothing. Now, what does the law say? The law says that an occupying power has the obligation, let's just get the right wording, it has an obligation to ensure the welfare of the occupied population. That's an obligation of an occupying power. Israel has breached in a flagrant and blatant manner that obligation as it imposed the siege. If you don't fulfill your obligation to make Gaza livable, then you have no right to use force, especially as the people are revolting because Israel did not fulfill its obligation to make Gaza livable. So you cannot claim under the Geneva Convention we have the right to maintain order. No, you don't. You had a right, but that went along with an obligation. Yes, you have the right to maintain order, but you also had an obligation to provide for and ensure the welfare of the civilian population. By imposing that siege, you breached your obligation, and therefore you have no right to maintain order, especially as the disorder is a result of the fact that you imposed an unlivable siege on Gaza. Number two, a little bit of a technical point. The situation in Gaza has two aspects to it. One, it's a self-determination struggle. And two, it's an occupation. But under international law, the primary right, the technical term for those of you who want to know it, would like to take it down and use it in dinner table chit-chat. It's called jus cogens, J-U-S, new word, C-O-G-E-N-S. And it just means this right is absolute. And the right to self-determination is absolute. And it takes primacy over the right that's accorded under the Fourth Geneva Convention. So the primary right is that right to self-determination, and under that right of self-determination, Israel has no right to use force. And the third point is, Israel cannot claim a right to use force because the occupation at this point in time, it's illegal. Israel has no rights any longer under the occupation. Is there a problem?
No.
No. There are no rights. Israel has no rights under international law any longer. Why? I don't want to go into all the technicalities. If you're interested, you can read my book, like Comrade Moran pretended to do, which is to say what virtually everybody I've ever met who claims to have read my books has pretended. I'll put it very simply. Under international law, what makes an occupation is it's supposed to end. If it doesn't end, it's no longer an occupation. It's an annexation. Is that clear, Tovarish Abramov?
Absolutely.
Okay. If the occupation doesn't end, it's no longer an occupation. You annex the land. Israel has occupied Gaza for 5 decades, which even Comrade Abramov will acknowledge is an awful long time. And I do think Comrade Abramov will also acknowledge that Israel, under at least its current leadership, has no intention of leaving. Well, if you have no intention of leaving, it's not an occupation anymore. It's de facto an annexation. In that sense, incidentally, it's an indisputable fact that Israel is an apartheid state. I'm not going to get into all the technicalities. I'm going to simply say Israel has effectively annexed the West Bank and Gaza because 5 decades have elapsed, and it's quite clear that they have no intention of ever leaving. Then it's an annexation. And so in the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, there are 2 populations. Half of that population has either marginal rights, namely the Palestinian citizens of Israel, or no rights at all, namely the Palestinians in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. So, if one class of people have all rights and the other half have marginal or no rights, it's clearly an apartheid state. However, that's not pertinent to what we're arguing now. For our purposes, Israel has annexed the territory. It's no longer a legal occupation. It's now an illegal occupation. They have no rights, and they cannot claim any rights under international law. If it's still claimed, and I know Tovarish, if it's still claimed that Israel has the right to use force, and I know Tovarish Abramov quite well, he's going to say these are all technical, legal points. They don't cut to the heart of what's going on there. So I'm going to try now to move from the technical points to the situation in Gaza. First of all, if you'll excuse me, comrades, Rafiq, you said?
Rafiqa, I'm feminine.
What?
I am Rafiqa. You are Rafiq, I am Rafiqa. Masculine and feminine. Okay? It's a grammar.
Not okay.
Rafiq.
There's a basic principle of law, which everybody here will immediately grasp, even though it sounds technical, because lawyers try to impress you that they somehow possess knowledge, which they don't. They're full of shit, excuse me. So, the technical principle is no rights can be derived from illegal acts. If you commit an illegal act, you can't claim a right from that act. Or it's obvious to put it in simple terms for simple people, it's obvious that in certain situations, a person does not have a right to self-defense. Now I see Tovarish Abramov, he's a little skeptical on that point. So I'll ask Tovarish Abramov, can a rapist claim a right to self-defense if the victim pummels him?
No.
Can a rapist claim a right to self-defense?
No.
Pretty obvious, correct? So, the right to self-defense doesn't obtain in all situations, correct? A theater owner has no right to self-defense if patrons attack him after he sets the building ablaze and impedes their flight. Would you agree to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. The Loews Theater, I don't know if it's still around. Mr. Loews is a pyromaniac. It's opening night of a Steven Spielberg film. The theater is packed. He decides to set the theater ablaze. And then he tries to block the emergency exit as people are rushing out. And then as they stampede over him, he starts fighting back, resisting, and he claims a right to self-defense. You will agree, Comrade Tovarish Abramov. You will agree that's absurd, correct?
Yes,
You will agree to that.
I will.
Well, I'm going to tell you now, even though you think, even though you are convinced that's a self-evident proposition, you are in a moment going to regret. You will regret having made that admission. Because watch now what you have admitted to. Israel's conduct vis-a-vis Gaza falls in the same category of acts that render null and void the right to self-defense. If it were otherwise, if they did have that right to self-defense, it would amount to the right to use military force in order to maintain an illegal occupation compounded by an illegal siege. Now, not just Comrade Tovarish Abramov, but all the human rights organizations, including the human rights organizations in Gaza, including the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, including Al-Maizan. They all say Israel has the right to use force in certain circumstances. Everyone agrees on that. But is it true? What is Gaza? It's a narrow coastal strip that is among the most densely populated areas on the planet. 70% of its population consists of refugees. More than half are children under the age of 18. What is Gaza? For over a decade, Israel has placed this speck of land under a devastating siege. 50% of Gaza's workforce is now unemployed. 80% because of that diabolical Mephistophelian siege depend on international food aid. 80%. Comrade, Tovarish, Abramov, that's more than the Russians are on food stamps in Brighton Beach. 96% of the tap water in Gaza is contaminated. 96% is contaminated because of that diabolical siege. The fence separating Gaza from Israel is no more a border than Gaza is a state. The distinguished Hebrew University professor Baruch Kimmerling, he said Gaza is a concentration camp. The former conservative British Prime Minister David Cameron, he called it an open-air prison. Israel's most distinguished newspaper, Haaretz, called it a ghetto. The Economist called it a human rubbish heap. The International Committee of the Red Cross called it a sinking ship. Gaza, what is Gaza? The UN Human Rights Chief, he called it a toxic slum in which an entire civilian population is caged from birth to death. A toxic slum. So I ask you, Comrade Tovarish Abramov, you laughed. You thought the question was rhetorical, even silly. Does a theater owner have the right to set ablaze his building and block the people who are trying to flee the flames? Does Israel have the right to use force to encage Gaza's 1 million children in a ghetto or a toxic slum? Do they have that right? Don't the people of Gaza have the right, the moral right, the legal right, the human right to break free from a concentration camp? I ask you, because you are one of those young people schooled in the lessons of the Holocaust, as they're called. So I ask you a question. Does anybody debate, does anyone now debate whether Germany used excessive or disproportionate force to suppress the Warsaw Ghetto uprising? Does anyone debate that question? Did they use excessive or disproportionate force to suppress the Warsaw Ghetto uprising? Who now ponders whether Germany had a right to self-defense against the Jewish fighting organization in the Warsaw Ghetto, who, let's not forget, they were not nonviolent, they used arms? Does anybody debate whether whether Nazi Germany had a right to self-defense against the Jewish fighting organization in the Warsaw Ghetto? It might be said, and I know what Tovarish Abramov is thinking, he's saying, but come on, Comrade Norm, you know Gaza is not the Warsaw Ghetto. But as an Israeli journalist who served in Gaza during the first Intifada, he said, the problem is not in the similarity, but that there isn't enough lack of similarity. The problem is not in the similarity. The problem is there isn't enough lack of similarity. Experts now predict that Gaza will soon be overrun by typhus and cholera epidemics, like those that decimated Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. When I read about the typhus epidemics that are now being anticipated, I remember my late mother, both of my parents were in the Warsaw Ghetto, and I remember her talking about the typhus. And I checked through the history books, and yeah, large numbers of Jews were wiped out in the ghetto because of the typhus epidemics, the ones which have now are devastating Yemen, South Yemen. No, Yemen. Oh, I'm still thinking 100 years ago, South Yemen. Okay. If, for argument's sake, it were granted that Israel has the legal right to use force to prevent the people of Gaza from escaping their prison, this would simply expose the poverty of the law. There was a very decent guy on the International Court of Justice. His name was Judge Veeramantri. If my memory is right, I could be wrong, I think he was from Sri Lanka. And he had made it his life's mission to try to get the International Court of Justice to declare nuclear weapons illegal. And in 1996, the International Court of Justice debated exactly that question. Is the threat or use of nuclear weapons legal under international law? And Veeramantri, in his dissenting opinion, he said, there's an irony. The irony is this. Whereas the law, international law, it condemns the use of dum-dum bullets, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, it wouldn't declare nuclear weapons illegal. And he said then this, it would seem passing strange that the expansion within the body of a single soldier, of a single bullet, the nature of a dum-dum bullet is it expands when it penetrates the body. And so it's claimed that it causes, the technical term is, unnecessary cruelty. And that was the grounds for banning it. So he writes, it would seem passing strange that the expansion within the body of a single soldier of a single bullet is an excessive cruelty which international law has been unable to tolerate since 1899. Dum-dum bullets were declared illegal in 1899. And yet, the incineration in 1 second of 100,000 civilians is not illegal. He said, the law is crazy. The law is lunatic. You're banning in the name of morality a dum-dum bullet, but you're not banning nuclear weapons. It's certified insanity, passing by the name of civilization. And then he says the following, a quote that I have always savored. Every branch of knowledge benefits from a process of occasionally stepping back from itself and scrutinizing itself objectively for anomalies and absurdities. If a glaring anomaly or absurdity becomes apparent, as in the case of banning dum-dum bullets, but not banning nuclear weapons, if a glaring anomaly or absurdity becomes apparent and remains unquestioned, that discipline is in danger of being seen as floundering in the midst of its own technicalities. You are so steeped, so mired in the technicalities of the law that you don't see that what you're saying is nuts. So he said sometimes you have to step back and kind of look at it as an extraterrestrial would to recognize there's something crazy here. The notion, Tovarish, that Israel has the right, the notion that Israel has the right to forcibly encage 1 million children in an unlivable space, it's an absurdity. And the lawyers debating whether or not Israel used excessive force to prevent Gazans from escaping their ghetto, they're floundering in the midst of technicalities. The great, wonderful, terrific Sarah Roy of Harvard University's Center for Middle Eastern Studies, she's the daughter of 2 survivors of Auschwitz concentration camp, and she also has a very impressive academic pedigree. She attended Harvard as an undergraduate. She got her PhD from Harvard. And she's just a really good egg, a really good person. Whenever she comes to New York, I spend time with her. I spent time with her this past week with her husband, who's an accomplished physician in pediatric surgery, and I also spent time with her younger daughter, who is just a delightful human being. And Sarah, even though she's an academic, her heart has not been snuffed out. She wrote, "Innocent human beings, most of them young, are slowly being poisoned in Gaza by the water they drink and likely by the soil in which they plant. The only morally sane question presented by the situation in Gaza, and now I'll put the question to you, Tovarish Abramov, does Israel have the right, in the name of self-defense, to poison 1 million children? Do they have that right? The children are trying to break out. They're in a toxic slum, a concentration camp, a human rubbish heap. They're being suffocated by that, if you'll excuse me, by that diabolical, satanic state. Does Israel have the right, in the name of self-defense, to herd, to corral, to pen up 1 million children in Gaza? They have that right? Because the moment you tell me they have that right, then you're telling me that Jews who tried to break out of a concentration camp or concentration camps, Nazi Germany had the right, in the name of self-defense, to kill them. Do you believe that? Is there any sane person who could possibly believe that? And yet it actually shocks the conscience, not to mention the intellect, that I couldn't find a single human rights organization, including B'Tselem from Israel, the Palestinian human rights organizations, which didn't make the self-evident fact. The issue is not whether they use excessive force. The issue is not whether they use disproportionate force. The issue is not whether the people in Gaza present an imminent threat. The only question is, does Israel have the right to poison children? That's it. End of story. Thank you. The question is, could I speculate on what goes on in the alleged minds of the Israeli leadership? It's not really difficult to divine, to discern, to figure out what goes on in their minds. The current leadership is wholly unlike its predecessors, who were convinced Zionists, and they did have a vision and an ideology, and they also had a genuine devotion to the cause that they avowed. They were the ideological generation, like, so to speak, what were called in the case of the Soviet Union, the old Bolsheviks. And many of the old leadership, they were themselves pretty close to being Bolsheviks. They came from the same tradition, which had its virtues and its dark side. The virtue was they were really not committed to privilege, to power as such. They were committed to the cause. The dark side was, like the Leninists, they were completely ruthless in their commitment to the cause. The new generation, people like Netanyahu, he has no commitment to anything except himself. He wants to win. So it's a case of assessing who are the main threats. When I say threats, I mean domestic. Who are the main domestic threats to his power, and how does he fend them off? It's pure party politics. So let's take a simple example. Take the case of the deal with Iran. It wasn't just Obama and his administration who supported that deal. Nearly the whole of Israel's military and security leadership, they supported it. They said it was a good deal. If Netanyahu opposed it, it was not because he had more insight or even doubted that it was a good deal. He knew it was a good deal. It was because there were powerful people to his right who were attacking the deal with Iran. And so for purely political reasons, not because of any devotion to the state of Israel, not for any devotion to the state of Israel, but because of politics. In the case of Gaza, it is true that they have this mindset which goes back to the old ideological leadership. You saw it a lot in people like David Ben-Gurion, Moshe Dayan, and others, that Arabs only understand the language of force. That if you show any weakness, give them an inch and they'll take a mile. And so you have to keep clobbering them until, in the immortal words of Ronald Reagan when he spoke about the Sandinistas, until they cry uncle. Palestinians, whether you agree or not, it's beside the point. Hamas has repeatedly said it's open to a long-term, sometimes they say 30 or sometimes they say 40 years, a long-term ceasefire with Israel. They're ready for it. Just end the siege. That's the quid pro quo. End the siege, we're willing to sign a long-term ceasefire. Israel doesn't even consider, Netanyahu won't even consider it. Because that would imply you're negotiating with them, as it were, as equals. But you don't negotiate with Arabs. You beat them. That's the mindset. Are there ways to resolve this situation now, maybe even to the detriment of the Palestinians? Yes, but Israel won't entertain that idea. You have to first take out the big club and crack their skull. That's the only way you can deal with Arabs. Mm-hmm.